This presentation is an accompaniment to our article by the same name, which will feature in the published proceedings for this Congress. Due to time constraints, we ask that you view what follows as an introduction and encourage you to read the text if you find what we have to say interesting. I will start by outlining the need for a system-level approach that accounts for complexity, and then hand things over to Ari, who will provide a case study to illustrate the mixed methods at work. There will be slides provided if you ask for them. Enjoy. For the organizational ergonomics practitioner, systems theory requires the analysis of the complexity that arises from the interactions between technological processes and human factors. While the maintenance of technological systems can be complicated, each procedure can, at least in principle, be understood and performed with sufficient individual knowledge and skill. Complexity enters the picture when one also attempts to account for the biological and cognitive factors of maintenance crew, the social factors of their training and their workplace, and all of the other elements that we refer to collectively as human factors. Thinking in terms of complex systems thus requires one to think in terms of interactions and unintended consequences, rather than in terms of single constructs and unidimensional interventions. Our contention is that there are some tendencies that hinder the analysis of human factors in complex socio-technical systems, and that mixed methods provides a way to avoid this issue, but also to strengthen analysis. First, there is the tendency to take for granted theoretical assumptions that are often difficult to substantiate. In response to this challenge, some practitioners have recommended moving toward operationalization, where priority is placed on demonstrating that numerically meaningful measurements can, more or less, predict real-world outcomes. This shift from a theoretically grounded discipline to a research-informed service may prove useful for addressing small design problems and strategies, but it undermines the ability of human factors to inform understandings of complex socio-technical systems. For now, let's refer to this as the conceptual validity critique. Second, there is the tendency for experimental psychology to investigate claims by testing isolated constructs using environments and subjects that at best can only simulate the real-world contexts in which they are to be applied. While such demonstrations may provide numerical data that can inform outcomes in design, issues occur when the tire of research-based design hits the road of the workplace. One way around this is to include the clause of all things being equal when imagining the applicability of such research. The issue here, of course, is that the real environment and the simulated environment are not truly equal, with ceteris paribus thus being yet another tendency that carries unnecessary risks for those seeking to make use of applied organizational ergonomics. We can call this the ecological validity critique. To those familiar with the debates over the value of laboratory experiments in social psychology that pervaded the 20th century, this critique will sound familiar and perhaps even outdated. After all, it is now largely acknowledged that, while the details of specific work environments can influence performance, people also carry attitudes and proclivities with them wherever they go. For example, think of a tendency to tune out of meetings or professional development sessions deemed unimportant, repetitive, or boring. Simply put, laboratory experiments that serve to test theoretical propositions to demonstrate that they can happen do not necessarily engender the additional claim that they will, in fact, happen. Hence, as laboratory experiments are helpful in determining possibilities, critiques that focus on probabilities, such as whether or not personnel are more likely to tune out of a team meeting held on land or at sea, are not suited to purpose. Hence, the critique being presented here is not a blank dismissal of findings developed off-site, but is rather leveled at the tendency to depend on one approach, be it laboratory experiments or fieldwork, rather than using them both in concert. We contend that one way for the practitioner to address these issues is by using a clear framework and mixed methods that draws on both quantitative and qualitative data. This is part of a larger organizational ergonomics project on how mixed methods can improve analysis of human factors in socio-technical systems. I will now hand things over to Ari, who will give a brief description of a recent project that we did with the Australian Navy to give you an idea of how these mixed methods might work in practice.
Okay, so based on the theory and the conceptual approach that you just heard, I'd like to talk now about a case history where we've actually put this to use. And the context is we're looking at human factors in the maintenance work of maintainers on Royal Australian Navy ships. And you can imagine that this is a fairly complex system involving the interactions between a fairly large centralized organization, the Royal Australian Navy. You have a highly trained workforce. They're working remotely from where the decision-making is going on. So that introduces complications. You've also got a very complicated workplace. So you've got maintenance of a number of different systems, electrical systems, diesel systems, navigational systems, etc. And just to make it even more complicated, you have the frequent introduction of new technology and new work systems as well. So we've got a fairly complex mix that we're working to, and we felt that this was an ideal situation to apply the mixed method approach. So we're now collecting quantitative and qualitative data and using them together. And we started with collection of failure data from the ship's failure logs. Wasn't a lot of useful information in that, but it did provide a good basis for the next stage of the project, which was the interviews. And the interviews, it's ostensibly qualitative information, but by using thematic analysis and coding the statements we had from the participants, we're able to quantify that data. And then quantifying that data allowed us to then decide what were the most important issues to the maintainers, and then use that in the construction of the next stage, which is the actual survey, quantitative survey. That was mainly multiple choice questions, so quantitative again, but there are also open-ended questions providing a qualitative basis for the information that we were getting. Looking at some of the data that we're getting from the interviews, this was coded on this coding sheet using, as I said, thematic analysis. So we're able to take the statements that we had in the interviews, extract the sub-themes from within the statements, start to aggregate those together in themes, which you can see in the sheet, and those were further then aggregated into human factors categories such as decision-making, information, training, etc. And by counting the number of times a statement occurred, it's a bit of a rough way of doing it, but it still gave us a basis for deciding what the most important issues were. And these then fed into the design of the survey. So you can see here some of the quantitative information that came out of the interviews. You can see the ordering and the fact that we could relate it back to different ranks within the workforce. And you can also see some of the human factors categories that we extracted from the coding of the interviews. This then fed into the actual interview sheet themselves. You see the human factors categories, information, planning, training, etc. And we typically created do you agree style questions from the statements made in the interviews. So for example, do you think the replacement of obsolete parts is well managed? Do you agree, yes and no? And once that information was analyzed, we could see graphically the responses from the participants using quantitative data. Of course, we can extract means, and the means would tell us which of the statements were most strongly felt by the workforce. And by looking at standard deviations, we could also determine what the diversity of opinion was throughout the workforce. So for here, we're looking at procedures and what their opinions were and how they might see the procedures that they had to work with. As I said, we also included some open-ended questions. So this allowed us to look at some of the things we might not have thought about or might give the participants an opportunity to add additional information to based on the multiple choice questions. And in this case, these are actually the statements that were given to us, written statements in the survey. We've done a thematic analysis on that, coded it so that we could actually have a ranking of the statements and the themes that go with them from within the open-ended questions. So basically, by following this approach, we took it out of the laboratory and put human factors back into the workplace. This seems to be the best way of dealing with a complex system because these systems typically are perception-based. There are a number of emergent issues that we typically find, and they do tend to be time variant, not stuck in time. Following this approach, it also gives us a way of identifying how different constructs might interact with each other, such as situation awareness and decision making, which again would be very difficult to do in a laboratory setting. And by using qualitative and quantitative data, this helps us understand context-dependent human factors, because the constructs from the interviews feed into the survey. It ensures that the survey are not only relevant in terms of the workplace, but also comprehensible to the people that were participating. And finally, we've included open-ended questions, because there's always something we may not have thought about, some supplementary information that participants may want to give us. And of course, they've always got their own ideas, so some of this may actually feed into the interventions that are designed for the workplace.
Good.
Beautiful.
Got it.
Lovely.